I was always struck by the quality of the guys. It doesn't matter whether you agree with everything they're doing or whatever, but it's just the underlying quality of a good private equity team is super impressive. And the one thing that I took from the Templars was the extraordinary things a small group of people can do.
Hi, and welcome to Basis Point. In this episode, we continue our fascinating conversation with Steve Tibble, former finance professional and world-renowned author who wrote several books on the Knights Templar. If you missed the first part of our conversation, I highly recommend you have a look because honestly, it's one hell of a ride. For this one though, we're shifting the focus from history to strategy. Seen through a modern lens, the Templars look like a compelling case study in power and capital allocation. A small and mysterious disciplined organization operating across borders and into foreign lands, managing political risk, serving powerful clients, kings, princes, and the church, while maintaining a clear strategic edge for nearly 2 centuries. Many of the fundamentals that underpin today's private equity and private credit world were already there. Long-term investment decisions, control of information, and a constant balancing act between influence and dependency. I had a blast recording this one. If you enjoy it, please like, comment, and subscribe to Basis Point. What makes this story matter to modern PE professionals isn't curiosity, it's proximity. A shadowy, God-serving elite that understood capital as power and wielded the checkbook with the same discipline as they did the sword. Their rise was strategic, and their fall, well, it was structural. And the lessons, they sit uncomfortably close to home. Have a look for yourself. Steve Tibble. So in the first part of our conversation, we kind of went over the fundamentals and debunked some myths about the Templars. And now I want to dive a little bit deeper into the parallels we can draw between modern private equity and the Templars' financial institutions. What fundamentals of private equity or debt, as we understand it today, were already existent and maybe perhaps even before the Templars?
I think if we're looking at broad similarities, you could probably divide it into two. There's kind of one set which are structural, human beings needing to transfer resources, invest, so on, in whatever form that takes. And then there's another package of similarities around what it is to be a human being and what it is that a super effective human being will do differently to somebody who just, sits on the ground all day. So I wrote a book about the assassins last year. And one thing that people often say to me about the assassins is they say, okay, these are the guys who invented political murder. And I kind of respond saying, almost, but I think ever since 2 monkeys picked up sticks, political murders existed. So the assassins were very, very good at it, but I think it's overstating to say they invented it. And I think it's similar with the Templars. I think finance and resource transfer and investments have always, well, for a very long time existed. If you look into Homeric society, you've got trade, you've got trust, you've got, investments like that. If you look at the Silk Roads, got a huge history. You look at Roman, Chinese, Indian societies, there's a rich heritage of the same kind of things. But I think particularly in Europe, there was a major downturn after the Roman Empire. And we're not allowed to say barbarians or dark ages or sort of, pejorative things like that anymore. But
The times were tough.
Exactly. So things got grim and a lot of things were forgotten, like Roman concrete. You look at the lovely roof and the Pantheon. I think it was nearly 1,000 years before we reinvented it. In the Renaissance, you start getting that level of concrete, you get self-supporting ceilings and so on. So we kind of forget that things get forgotten. We like to think of a linear line for life. That's not true. I mean, shares can go down as well as up, and societies and cultures too. So what the Templars did do, together with a lot of the great Italian cities like Pisa, Genoa, Venice, they reinvigorated the financial and investment and trading opportunities for Western Europe. And the magic thing about the Templars is that they managed to combine so many kind of elite professional services at the same time as being, arguably the world's best troops, or certainly the best troops in Europe, at a time when, it's all this kind of glamorous fighting going on. So it's this weird magic combination.
Today, if we look at a group of financial professionals that kind of gather all of these different skills of cultural understanding, strategy, vision. So we'd be looking at PE professionals.
Yeah, having worked in the business for many years back in an earlier lifetime, I was always struck by the quality of the guys. It doesn't matter whether you agree with everything they're doing or whatever, but it's just the underlying quality of a good private equity team is super impressive. And the one thing that I took from the Templars was the extraordinary things a small group of people can do if they're incredibly focused, committed to what they do, and are able to take the bigger view and develop strategy, have a genuinely longer term vision.
So looking at the Templars, what investments did they make, and how did they decide where to allocate their resources?
You get up at 4 a.m, do weapons training, and then you have your asset allocation meeting. Yeah, they had quite good allocation of staff. So that a lot of the staff in the Middle East were very sophisticated soldiers and diplomats because they were working in that environment. Whereas the guys in Western Europe were very sophisticated lawyers and financial experts. So they were dealing with the highest, low bar. We're talking Middle Ages here, but the highest levels of finance they had. And they were absolutely able to operate at both levels. Some examples, I know it sounds silly, but mills are the medieval equivalent of, IT. So they're the kind of high tech thing. So if you have a water mill or a windmill, that's technology for the 12th century. And interestingly, you find when the Templars have a piece of land, they're much more likely to invest, and they put the technology in. We can prove, we've got data to show that they actually generated a higher rate of return from their fields. And it sounds crass, and they were able to select the kind of product better. So they were able to plant the more expensive wheats and those kind of things that would be a good cash crop, because they needed cash rather than just food to go out to the Middle East. You can't transport a loaf of bread from Edinburgh to Jerusalem. It's going to be moldy long before it gets there, and the horse will have eaten it, or whatever. But what you want is cash, and then you can develop a system of joint finance and logistics for transferring that cash by means of promissory notes through London, through Paris, and then back out to Egypt or Palestine.
It's a whole economy that they've created, really.
Yeah.
So creating resources, generating cash, transferring that cash, and then using that cash to develop other locations.
Absolutely. And logistics, they had their own fleets of ships. They used to buy ships. They used to broker ships, as well as make them, sail them. They were a kind of financial services conglomerate combined with diplomacy and ultra-violence.
How do you become a Templar? I mean, is there a Templar school? I mean, because you got to be super good at so many things.
Yeah.
How are they selected?
Yeah. Well, everybody's volunteer. So I think there is kind of self-selection.
What if you suck? What if you're a super bad Templar?
If you get the idiots, there's plenty of places you can put them. As long as they can hold the gun or their equivalent, you're fine. And you're absolutely right. Often they weren't the brightest guys. If you look at them theologically, and we know what their libraries were, because when they got closed down, there were inventories of their possessions, and we know their books, by and large, were incredibly dull. They were very, there are all these legends about them being Satanists. In fact, they were the most orthodox, unimaginative guys, many of them. And those guys were they were the butch arm of the business. So it's sort of like running a mercenary outfit. And those guys were superb soldiers, very committed, but you don't need to be, a philosopher to do that job. On the other hand, most of the guys in the UK, for instance, either if you volunteered in the UK, you would either you'd go to weapons training school and get shipped out to Lebanon or Syria or wherever, or if you were had inclinations to be a lawyer or a financier, then you'd be trained up, and those guys would take over what was for the purposes of the time, relatively complex things. And you could end up advising the king, handling the king's money, handling the crown jewels, and so on. They used to have to, when the king went traveling and he wanted to impress, he often would have a Templar escort, and they'd take the crown jewels down to Tewkesbury or wherever he was going to be. And the natives could be very impressed at how much money their king had spent on his own jewels,
What caused their downfall? apart from the French monarchy that you mentioned
Yeah.
in the first part of our conversation. And what heritage did they leave us?
No, it's a good point. But taking the first point first, there's a one-word answer, which is redundancy. So basically, the Templars had one job, and their job was to defend the Holy Land, to defend the local Christian communities, and keep the place as a going concern. And they failed massively. They kept it going for 200 years, which I think is extraordinary. There's just a few hundred guys out there, not a big army, but they managed to keep the ship afloat with help for 200 years. But if you look at Google Map, they didn't have Google Earth or whatever. If you just look at the situation, which they must have realized, that they're just completely surrounded, they're outnumbered 10-1. The weird thing is that they
lasted that long.
They lasted that long. The Crusades should have been finished in the first long weekend after the guys arrived. There was no reason. It was only Muslim disunity in the first instance that let them go in there, and the guys did a good job, but ultimately it was an unwinnable war. So you could say they're on hiding to nothing, and at the end of that, they became redundant. The French king took them out because he wanted their cash. And
there was something about a curse?
Yeah, I mean, again, that may be true. I think it's legendary that the last master, a guy called Jacques de Molay, when he was being burnt, you get a bit bitter if you're being burnt alive. You don't you lose your sense of humor. And he started to shout about the king. And interesting, the king did die within a year, and the Pope, who the king had been bullying, died within a year as well. I mean, so you don't get on the wrong side of the Templars. So yeah, so I don't believe it, obviously, but yeah.
What did they leave us then?
In a macro sense, they led the professionalization of Europe. I mean, if you think of history, particularly West European history, it takes a massive nosedive at the end of the 5th century. The last Roman legions disappear. The guys leave England, for instance, or leave Britain, and say, oh, we'll be back, don't worry. And it's like, of course, they're never coming back, and everything just falls off a cliff. And Europe has this long, slow march back to a more sophisticated level of civilization. And I think the Templars played a very significant role in moving a lot of the factors that make for a civilized society, logistics, law, regardless of whether you like lawyers or bankers, they contributed a huge amount in those arts that are so important to create the kind of sophisticated society that we aspire to.
If you had to give PE professionals 3 lessons from the Templars, what would they be?
Ultimately, things have moved on so far that actually the thing to remember is the kind of human element. I think that if you look at what they did, it gives you a very clear sense of the importance of strategy. You don't keep a ship of state afloat for 200 years in the face
by
of
winging it,
imminent death. Yeah, no, absolutely. These were guys with a view of the bigger picture, and they were able to do that. Secondly, I think they show what a small group of people can do if they are committed, and it's probably
aligned, probably.
Yeah, absolutely, aligned around a central set of objectives and strategy. But also, if they're all working as a team, it's and a team that is almost prepared to sacrifice. Now, I know it's not fashionable to talk about, bankers and private equity as making sacrifices, because I guess everybody does. But, I know from working in the industry, people work incredibly hard. They do sacrifice time that they could have spent with their family. They are totally focused on the goal. And, again, regardless of whether you agree with all the outcomes or not, that is hugely impressive. And I think the final thing is just a focus on leadership. That if you can all get behind the same idea and you have clarity of view as a team, you can go into a business, you can go inculcate a management team, work with a management team to put in place longer term change. The change that isn't dictated by a quarterly report. It's not kind of 12-week reporting. It's a longer term view of the world. And I think private equity is very, very well suited to the kind of lessons you can take from that.
Steve Tibble, this was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Really enjoyed it.
That's it for today. Don't forget to click below to subscribe to the official Basis Points YouTube channel.